Between 1950 and 2020, the world experienced the greatest phase of material and immaterial growth in the history of humanity. There has never been so much growth in such a short time. The amount of wealth, both material and immaterial, that was produced. In those 70 years, it was more than all the rest of human history combined. And the absolutely vast majority of people can't understand that. We have never lifted so many people out of poverty, out of hunger, never created so much technology, never created so many jobs, never created so much property as in this period. Understand that I'm not saying it was a perfect period and that poverty and hunger were absolutely eradicated. And I'm not even saying that this creation of wealth was distributed equally and fairly throughout the world. No, what I'm saying is that even with these differences, these imperfections, and still with these injustices, even so, it was the period of greatest growth and wealth distribution that humanity has ever witnessed. Economic and intellectual growth had already begun with the Industrial Revolution. The fourth technological singularity, which, for those who don't know what technological singularities are four key or bottleneck technologies that have changed humanity in the last 200 to 300,000 years. But since the Industrial Revolution, which was the last one, this whole thing exploded. And we started this impressive upward phase with decades of stagnation or even of contraction, but never of real decline, even if it was higher than the previous expansion phase. It would be like saying that since 1800 we have taken 3 steps forward and sometimes 1 step back, only to then take 3 more steps forward again. But, starting from 1950, we took even more than those 3 steps forward in the span of 220 years. We went from sailing ships, which had been the standard for navigation for thousands and thousands of years, to airplanes, and we even managed to set foot off the planet. We produced more food than enough to feed all of humanity several times over. And I know there will be people saying that there's still hunger in the world. Okay, that's true, but understand that it's not a matter of production, but of distribution, politics, storage, waste, logistics, and so many other problems. Because in terms of production, today food production is more than enough to supply all of humanity with ease, something unprecedented and revolutionary in human history. We were already following this path, but as I said, all of this exploded even more starting from 1950. Which in a way made humanity somewhat arrogant. Arrogant, thinking that this growth would be infinite and forever, and therefore that this growth would be something normal. Without understanding that, in fact, it was an anomaly that perhaps in the worst-case scenario might be ending. In fact, it's even worse than that. There are many, really many people who even celebrated, and still celebrate, the end of this period, celebrating that the forces that created this environment are starting to collapse. Because of partisanship, geopolitical or historical illiteracy, or even a blind and obsessive hatred that ends up being self-destructive. But anyway, what were these forces? Of the 3 forces, 2 still exist today, although they are about to end, but a third was actually the first of these forces. It was the establishment of global maritime free trade. The second was Eurasian stabilization, and the third, the sanctity of national borders. The first, which was this establishment of global maritime trade, was fundamental. It was a direct effect of Bretton Woods and the United States Navy ensuring the functioning of the naval routes. It's the foundation of everything. Because now then, all nations from that moment on, after World War II that had access to the seas, could trade with all the other nations. Total naval blockades like in the past would no longer be tolerated. Although there would still be certain blockades of ports, these blockades would only be within certain legal parameters aimed at the entry or exit of weapons. But aside from that, blockades involving food, medicine, machinery, and other things that were not for military purposes, no, it would not be allowed. Piracy, as in the 19th century, would also be prohibited. The second force, which was the Eurasian stabilization, was because of the Soviet Union, even though it used a very heavy iron hand. And remember, the world is not how we would like it to be, but it is the way it is. Still, it produced a positive effect, which was this regional stabilization. Because look, for centuries and centuries, these countries in Central Asia and part of the Middle East and even part of Eastern Europe had never had even a minimum of stable governments. But the Soviet Union, even in its own way, created infrastructure, built ports, airports, roads, railways, hospitals, schools, and also promoted free universal education. eradicating illiteracy among peoples who until then, in many cases, were still divided into tribes and clans. And besides that, they mainly created bureaucratic institutions that organized and were finally able to bring a sense of a modern state to these peoples, many of whom had never had functional states and governments. This brought stability, and even with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, these countries now had infrastructure and political organization, enough so they wouldn't collapse. Back to clan-based tribal societies in the face of the Soviet Union. Actually, with the fall of the Soviet Union and this state legacy, they even took great advantage of the post-Cold War wave of globalization, and they became very wealthy. See, this isn't about excusing authoritarianism, it's about accepting that this is what happened. It could have been different, but it wasn't. That's how it was, so there's no point in discussing alternative history, just accept that it happened this way and produce these positive effects, even if it was through bad means. But then we have the third force, the sacredness of borders. Understand that World War II was so traumatic that everyone who took part in it made sure that nothing like it would ever happen again. And now, after 70 years, that feeling is gone. So it's really sad to see people going back to celebrating wars for annexation or border violations because they don't understand the magnitude of the trauma that war caused for those who lived through it. Because all those countries there, even with huge geopolitical rivalries, huge ideological rivalries, sometimes even with mutual hatred, they tried in every way to ensure that wars for territorial annexation and conquest would no longer be accepted in the modern world under any circumstances. Of course, that didn't prevent wars from happening in the following years, but, and this is very important, really important for you to understand, they weren't wars for territorial annexation and conquest. Wars now, from the end of World War II onward, would have to be for other reasons, not for the acquisition of geographic territory like in the past. Or they would have to operate in complicated legal loopholes, which wouldn't be exactly about conquest, like, for example, in the Vietnam War or the Korean War. They weren't exactly wars of conquest, because technically it wasn't one country invading another, but rather the same country that was divided and was now trying to reunify. Or if one country invaded another, it would only do so with the support of international law, and it wouldn't be to conquer it, but to punish that country's leadership. For a reason that, again, I'm not saying it was fair or legitimate, but war for territorial annexation became, let's say, a red line for the acceptance of wars. Wars for other reasons were accepted and even condemned, but war for conquest was ruled out, so borders were considered sacred elements in the international scenario. It didn't matter if it was a democracy or a dictatorship. You didn't mess with another country's border. It looked bad, in fact. It looked so bad that even the aggressor country's allies ended up abandoning and criticizing it, as became clear when Iraq invaded Kuwait and almost the entire world condemned the Iraqis, and even those who didn't condemn them didn't show support. So, you see that we had an open ocean reserved for trade, and a pacified and organized interior continent for production, and a frozen political map that gave everyone the security to invest and plan for the future? After all, now, no one needed to spend almost their entire economy worrying about an external invasion anymore. And as I said, this third force was something collective, based on the trauma of World War II, but it was something led by the United States. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about the United States, especially the fanboys of the United States, who can't see an F-22 fighter jet without getting excited, is that the main strength of this country was not its technology or even its powerful armed forces. The main strength of the United States was its ideology, its culture, and what they represented as a new world. They were much more successful in getting countries on their side when they came with money and ideological values than when they came with their navy and their army. Of course, that has changed a lot since then, because they changed. But understand that until the 1990s, or at least the 2000s, it was like that. They represented a break from the old world, a world that was previously based on imperialism and conquest, so the Americans now represented pragmatism and national freedom. See, I'm not saying that they were actually like that, nor that they didn't make mistakes. After all, if you follow the channel, you'll see that they made a lot of mistakes, but understand that this is what they represented. Symbolically, a series of new values in international relations. And this was a very useful tool to co-opt to pull more friends to their side than to the Soviet side, which was also a factor that ended up leading to their victory in the Cold War. The point is that the wars the Americans would fight would be different from the wars fought by the main imperial powers of the early 20th or 19th centuries, because they weren't wars of conquest. They were wars that had other arguments, other motivations, but it wasn't brute conquest, so it was a break from those old imperial forces. Of course, imperialism didn't end, but it renewed itself. What ended was the traditional form of empire. It was no longer about territorial conquest and the subjugation of peoples. It was about a market imperialism that aimed to conquer hearts, minds, and above all, wallets. Whether we like it or not, even though it's not ideal, at least it was somewhat less bad than the violent wars of conquest in the past. So yes, whether we like it or not, it's progress, because, again, the world isn't the ideal place we want it to be, but at least it was somewhat less bad. So this global structure that we saw, that made the world as we know it today, was designed by the United States. And this benefited everyone, but obviously it benefited them even more. However, then we reached the year 2000. And in 2001, from that point on, the world jumped to what we have today. And that's not good at all, because in 2001, the United States suffered the biggest terrorist attack in history, and almost the whole world shared their pain, even their rivals. And the support for the American invasion of Afghanistan was practically unanimous, up to that point, okay? However, this had two very negative effects. The first is that Americans for the first time felt vulnerable and therefore they overreacted. And second, Washington misinterpreted this as a blank check to do whatever they wanted. And based on that, in 2003 they invaded Iraq, and here, unlike Afghanistan, it was almost a global condemnation. This was the problem because, unlike the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq did not have international support and was not backed by international law. The Americans literally ignored the law and invaded Iraq, and what happened is that nothing came of it. Most countries condemned the invasion but took no action and couldn't do much anyway, since the United States was the world's largest economy and top military power. No one could do anything. No one had the courage to sanction them or anything like that. And here comes the point that no matter how much you are against any other country, whether you like it or not, you need to keep something in mind. And this meant one thing. Anyone who wanted to invade another country, as long as they had enough military strength and an economy that was globally integrated, very connected with other countries, could do the same and get away with it. That's what the Americans taught. Of course, there will be people arguing absurd and heinous things like saying that Iraq was a dictatorship and therefore had no sovereignty. But that's stupid, really stupid, because the concept of sovereignty has nothing to do with the type of political regime of a country. Absolutely nothing. A country's legitimacy and sovereignty don't come solely from being a democracy. No, it's not being a dictatorship or a democracy that defines sovereignty. So, understand that this is something childish said by dishonest people who want to justify the unjustifiable, because what defines sovereignty was that sacredness of borders that I mentioned earlier. And the exceptions that allow intervention in a country only happen with international approval. Keep that in mind. So, the school, Bush, yes, gave the pretext for Putin to invade Georgia in 2008 and then Ukraine in 2022. It's not about making excuses for Russia. That's what the invasion of Iraq taught us. You can invade someone and get away with it if you're strong enough to stop anyone from attacking you. You don't have to agree with or like the Russians, you just have to understand that this is what they base their actions on. And unfortunately they were right, because the effects in Ukraine showed exactly that. So, this sacredness of borders, which made the world what it is today, was put in the intensive care unit in 2003 so that finally the Russians could put this sacredness in the coffin in 2022. But then you remember back there when I said that the whole planet, the whole world benefited from these forces that drove globalization, obviously some more than others, but definitely to some degree everyone. Well then, it turns out that over time, other countries adapted so well to this new global structure. But so well that not even the very engineers of this structure, the United States, managed to do as well as these countries. An example of this is South Korea and Singapore. That's when they stopped and thought, everyone is profiting off of me. And that's not fair, even though for a long time they were the main beneficiaries of this structure. They realized other countries were taking advantage of them, and Donald Trump's election and behavior reflects that. They decided it wasn't fair for them to pay for this globalization structure that they created. So they are pulling back to what is of their immediate interest: the Americas, the Arctic, and the Pacific. Up to that point, that's fine. This would have a negative effect on the global system, but it was still something manageable. One or more countries could even take partial responsibility for this structure. But the problem was that the Americans are now acting the same way as the empires of the 19th century, wanting to annex by military force and wanting to dictate who trades with whom. And that's a problem because it goes against the very pillars of the power structure built by the Americans themselves. Threatening Denmark to take Greenland by any means necessary, determining who Venezuela will or will not trade with. Engaging in trade blockades and piracy against ships that weren't carrying weapons, it goes against everything that made the United States the power it is today. This isn't about supporting the Venezuelan dictatorship, despite what those with a binary mindset may claim. This is to show how the United States is acting in a way that they themselves would have condemned 20 or 30 years ago. Trump acts like the childish kid who bought the ball and now wants to end the game because his friends play better than he does. Of course, the United States didn't support globalization out of altruism. They did it because they controlled the rules, controlled the routes, controlled the money, and controlled security. And that gave the United States predictability, preferential access, political influence, and structural power. But when you dismantle the system, you destroy the return on your own investment. American power has always worked best first with seduction, then with pressure, and only then with military force as a last resort. But when the United States goes straight to threats, naval blockades, and open coercion, they are burning their own political capital. They are undermining the very power structure that made them the leading power. The elites of these countries then start to think, if I don't obey the United States today, tomorrow I might be the next target. And this will inevitably lead to more diversification of partners, searches for alternatives to the dollar, and defensive alliances against the United States itself. In the long run, that is, in the long and medium term, it's less American control, not more. So what they and those who applaud this haven't realized is that this will be shooting themselves in the foot. Because American hegemony was built on this relationship of trust and the defense of values. The world used the dollar not just because it was forced to, but because it trusted that it was a stable and neutral currency. The world accepted American leadership because it trusted that they would guarantee borders and trade. And this will push the world to look for alternatives, and it will speed up the end of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And this over time will only push Europe, Asia, and the global south to create their own systems away from the United States. The biggest risk for the United States right now is if the world realizes it doesn't need the United States anymore, and then it will be too late. Those celebrating the United States' actions against Venezuela, believing the United States will liberate Venezuela, should reconsider. One thing I always try to make clear here on the channel is that in geopolitics, what determines things are action, reaction, and precedents. Today, people praise the United States' stance toward Venezuela, seeing a left-wing government in Venezuela and a right-wing one in the United States. But honestly, it's not that right-wing. But in the future, if the structure of government changes in the United States and it's a left-wing government, who's going to stop them from doing this against a right-wing government? No one can guarantee that. And that's the problem: unpredictability and instability. Well, folks, so given that, we have two most likely scenarios. One very bad scenario and one that's not so bad, although it's not ideal. The ideal would be that none of this was happening, but here we are. And in the first scenario, the United States really takes this step back, but focused on its own interests, which are the Western Hemisphere, the Arctic, and the Pacific. And when I say Western Hemisphere, I'm talking about the Americas as a whole. And it maintains this extremely aggressive stance, revitalizing the old empires like we saw before World War II. And that's going to be pretty bad, because it's going to raise the price of food, it's going to raise the price of energy. If you like industrialized and high-tech products, forget it, because they're going to become practically inaccessible, so everyone is going to be affected. It's not a good scenario, but we have the second scenario, which again is not the ideal scenario, but it's a scenario that, okay, we can move forward with, which is a scenario where the United States does this, pulls back. But the international community itself not only rejects this more aggressive stance from the United States, kind of isolating them and giving them a shakeup, but it maintains, and this is important, If it happens, it keeps this global economic circuit, this interconnected economy, functioning. They now take on the international community, take responsibility with small regional leaders there, taking on a leading role in their surroundings, and so on, and making this global economy now so mature and so developed that it would already be moving forward on its own. Without the need for a major global policeman to make it work, it would be the ideal scenario, because in that case, the United States would end up realizing that they might even risk being isolated as a whole. And eventually, they would try to reinsert themselves again because they would realize that the political cost of stepping away didn't turn out as they planned, and then they would end up gradually coming back. But now, they wouldn't have such an important role anymore because now this world economy would be moving on its own, and we wouldn't feel the effects as much under these circumstances. Anyway, let's hope that if we get to those circumstances, the situation will be this scenario, which is less bad. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Share the video with everyone you know to help the Geopolitics Mundial channel keep growing. After all, YouTube practically ignores this channel. It sweeps it under the rug, so your help sharing this channel is very important. But if you really like Geopolitics Mundial, consider becoming a member if you become a member. Not only will you get early access to these videos, like the one you're watching now, but you'll also have access to exclusive videos that are even more technical, niche, and specialized. And they're aimed only at the paying audience, which is responsible for 90% of the channel's revenue. So, thanks to the members, the Geopolitica Mundial channel can exist. That's it, guys. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next video.